Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Victoria, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to our colleagues, friends, and neighbors for coming out and being with us this evening for this conversation. An extra special thank you to Dawoud for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Happy to be here.
We are honored to have you. This is a really special event for us because with this conversation, we are inaugurating a series of talks that we're going to do here at NXTHVN that will culminate the end of our programmatic year. And so you are trailblazing that for us, and I couldn't think of a better artist to do that with because your work really embodies the qualities and just the values of our mission here at NXTHVN, which we'll get to see tonight through your work.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Very welcome.
And thank all of y'all for coming this evening.
So for tonight's conversation, we're going to focus on a series of works within the last
10 years.
10 years. But for those of you who don't know, Dawoud Bey's practice extends back for 40 years. So we're getting a snapshot of really just the massive amount of cultural production that you have created.
Thanks. It's actually 3 projects beginning in 2012. I left one of them out just for reasons of time from 2012 up to the most recent project in Louisiana.
Yes, and these are 3 projects from your history series.
They're all from the history series that begins with the Birmingham Project in 2012.
So if you can start just by giving us a brief introduction to what the Birmingham Project is.
Well, the Birmingham Project began in a kind of epiphany moment. The project goes back to when I was 11 years old, and the writer, James Baldwin, came to speak at the church that I grew up in Queens, New York. And after Baldwin's talk, there was a book that was available. It wasn't Baldwin's book, but the whole event may well have been a fundraising event for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the civil rights organization that was more popularly known as SNCC. And SNCC had published a book called The Movement. And it was a book of photographs of and about the civil rights movement. And they had given these photographs, some of which were quite horrific. There were lynching photographs in the book and other photographs that documented the civil rights movement. In a sense, you could say that some of those photographs, especially the more horrific ones, were everything that my parents had tried to protect me from or shield me from up to that moment. And my parents bought the book after Baldwin's talk. They brought it home. I was 11 years old, so what you don't do with an 11-year-old is tell them that you must look at this book. If they had told me that, maybe, maybe not, but they just left the book on the coffee table. And I picked it up and started looking at the photographs in that book. That book, the shape of the world for me changed with that book. And it changed in particular with one photograph of a wounded black girl laying in a hospital bed with thick gauze bandages covering her eyes. And it was a photograph of Sarah Jean Collins, who was the older sister of Addie Mae Collins, who was one of the 4 girls who had been killed in the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, a year before the publication of the book. And I saw that photograph, and mind you, it wasn't the most horrific of all of them, but that photograph seared itself into my psyche. I don't think that I intuited at that time that one of the reasons may well have been because I was the same age as the girl in that picture. So that particular photograph stayed with me. I would have periodic nightmares about that picture. And finally, I parked it somewhere in my psyche, in my subconscious, and stopped thinking about it. Some 40 years later, one morning, that picture came flashing back to me. You know that expression, to sit bolt upright? Well, I didn't exactly know what to sit bolt upright meant until that moment. I was laying in bed, and just suddenly, as if someone were pushing or slapping me on the back of the head, I literally sat bolt upright in bed, and that picture came flashing back. And so I knew I needed to do something with that. I was in the midst of another project at that time, Class Pictures project, but I started making periodic trips to Birmingham in preparation for making work there at some point. That was about that moment. I had no idea how I could respond in terms of the work I could make. But the first thing that I wanted to do, and I didn't know anyone in Birmingham, I'd never been to Birmingham, and I spent a weekend there, primarily wanting to go to a church service at the 16th Street Baptist Church on that Sunday, which I did. I spoke to the minister at 16th Street Baptist Church after the service, and that became a very complicated conversation that allowed me to know how complicatedly that history was dealt with in Birmingham, as opposed to my own subjective interest in it. In the interest of time, I won't go into too many details, but when I told the minister that I was thinking of coming back to make some work, and he asked me about what, and I told him that moment, September 15th, 1963, and his response really set me back on my heels. That made me realize that the way that history was being thought about and lived some 40 years later at that point was very different than my own subjective interest in it. But that began a series of periodic trips to Birmingham to get to know the place, to get to know the people. And then finally, when I was sure I wanted to make some work without knowing the material or conceptual shape of it, I did something that I had been doing for a number of years. I contacted the Birmingham Museum of Art, which was the one museum other than the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, because I knew whatever work I wanted to make, I would want to have an exhibition of that work. So I got in touch with the Birmingham Museum of Art, told them I had an idea, went and met with the then curator of African diasporic art. They were in between contemporary and modern curators. So I went and had a conversation with them and just told them, I'm interested in doing something, and if you're willing to partner with me on this, I'd like to have the opportunity to figure this out. I made numerous trips to Birmingham, and finally the director said to me, well, you know, this next September is going to be the 50th year of this tragedy that you've been talking about. And if we're going to do this, that would seem to be the time to present this project. It may have been 2 years. Given the funding cycle, it was probably 2 years before that she said that to me. And that kind of constituted a firm commitment on the institution's part. And then working with the museum's education department, which had relationships with schools in Birmingham, and working with different people in the museum, I started to reach out to the community through the institution.
And Dawoud, who are the people in the photographs?
These people, ultimately, you can keep slowly moving them forward. The people in the photographs are all people who at that time were currently living in Birmingham. After several years of trying to figure out the conceptual shape of the work, I decided to make portraits of young people who were the same ages as the 6 young people, 4 girls and 2 boys, who had been murdered that day. I felt that still left the work somewhat incomplete, and so I decided to also make photographs of adults the same age as those 6 young people would have been had they not been killed. So the girl in this picture is probably 11 and the woman is 61, which kind of conceptually collapses those 50 years into one photograph.
Do they know each other?
None of the people, with a few exceptions, none of the people knew each other before I photographed them. They're all photographed separately, mind you. They're not sitting in the same space together. These are individual photographs that were made, and then I created diptychs from the individual photographs. They're made in 2 locations. One of them is Bethel Baptist Church, very significant church in the civil rights movement in Birmingham that was pastored by Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, an activist minister. And the other location was the 17th century room of the Birmingham Museum itself. I wanted both pieces of Birmingham's social history to be a part of the frame of the work. The Black communal space of the church, and then the museum, which during the civil rights movement, like all institutions in the South, had been a segregated institution. So I wanted both of those sites to be the places where the photographs were made. So I photographed these individuals and then put these diptychs together, looking at them for some kind of relational connection, whether gestural, some of them have an uncanny physical connection. And then in September of 2013, exactly 15 years to the date of that incident in 1963, the work opened at the Birmingham Museum of Art.
And what was the reception of the work?
Well, it was interesting. I mean, both the reception of the work and some of the older people who came to be photographed in the museum. It was clear that this was the first time they'd ever been in the museum. Because mind you, when they were younger, it was a segregated institution. So you don't grow up with a warm and fuzzy, intimate relationship with that institution. So it was clear when a number of them walked in, kind of looking around, taking it all in for the first time. It was clear that they had never been in that museum before. And of course, that is part of the larger project of my work, is a kind of reinvention of the institutional space to collapse the space between my practice as an artist, the institution, and the communities in which I make my work. So Some of them came in. I try not to intrude on the viewer's experience. You know, some were crying, some were just very quiet, because for the older subjects, the last thing they probably thought was that they'd ever be hanging in the Birmingham Museum of Art. Couldn't even come into the museum. How are you going to end up on the walls in that same museum? You know, and all of that is a part of the larger ambition of the project of my work.
And do the sitters have an opportunity to engage with the photographs beyond it hanging in the museum? Do they continue to have a relationship with the image?
And for pretty much all or most of the exhibitions that I've done, museum exhibitions, there is a programming component that kind of furthers the dialogue in a programmatic way that the actual work begins. In addition to everybody in the photograph getting a reasonably sized print of themselves in return for their participation in the project. But after the exhibition, you know, there's always this opportunity for programming that more deeply engages in an active conversation with the community. And all of that is part of the experience of the work that I shape within the institutional and museum context.
You stated, and I'm going to paraphrase this, that you want a sense of specific time to be present in your photographs. How does that statement relate to the sense of time that you're creating in a project like this?
Tell me that paraphrase again.
You want a sense of specific time to be present in the photographs.
Yeah, because the work is about history, but it's being made in the contemporary moment. And from the beginning of this history work with the Birmingham Project, I've tried to create this liminal space that is both past and present at the same time. Because I made the work, so clearly it's of the contemporary moment. It's now. Like, I made this a year ago. But what it alludes to is something that took place 50 years ago. And for me, the conceptual challenge was how to make that resonate within the photographic object. How do you make that history resonate in a way that is deeply felt? You know, because with this work, one of the ways that happens is by giving a tangible sense of presence to an 11 and 14-year-old black girl. Because the 4 girls who were killed in the bombing of the church, and the 2 boys that most people don't even know about, who were killed in the violent aftermath of the dynamiting of the church, they have tended to take on a kind of mythic presence. The 4 girls, or the 4 little girls. No, this girl, this is what an 11 and a 14-year-old black girl looks like. And but for a change in circumstance, what happened to those girls could be this girl. Like, this is what an 11-year-old black girl looks like. Not a 4 little girl, but an 11-year-old black girl. You know, when I was working on this project, my heart would catch sometimes, because an 11-year-old girl comes walking in, they're only about this tall. It's a child. You know, so one of the things that I wanted to do with the work was to give a palpable sense of presence to something that has taken on a kind of ambiguously mythic sort of dimension.
And how are these works titled? We don't get to experience it in these images, but is the titling also a device by which you play with that sense of time and presence?
Well, for me, if we move forward to the next one, I can probably answer that in a different way.
Okay.
Because this one was the specificity of Birmingham. this is the Birmingham Project, about something that happened here. Night Coming Tenderly Black, which is a project that I did several years after the Birmingham Project and completing the Class Pictures Project. It's a project that's about the Underground Railroad, specifically in northeastern Ohio. I was commissioned by the Front Triennial in Cleveland to make work for the 2017 triennial. And I told them I could only participate if I was able to continue the history work that I was doing. Because I didn't want to stop that work and do something for the triennial. And so my research quickly revealed the significance of the Underground Railroad to Cleveland and to northeastern Ohio because of its proximity to Lake Erie and then Canada. So I began this work, which Night Coming Tenderly Black conceptually takes its cues from a poem by Langston Hughes. And the last couplet of that poem is night coming tenderly, black like me. And I started thinking about that phrase, you know, night coming tenderly, you know, because we think of, we tend to think of nighttime and darkness as being a kind of a place of fear, a kind of the unknown. And yet, he said, night is coming tenderly, black like me. And so with that, I started to think about the blackness of the space that these fugitive enslaved African Americans were moving through, and then the tenderness of that space, this warm embrace through which they were moving towards freedom. You can't really tell from these projections, but the photographs are very dark. And I took my cues materially from Roy DeCarava, whose work I hope some of you know. And a number of Roy's photographs are they're about black subjects, but the prints materially are very dark. It's about black subjects moving through this materially black space and doing that inside of a narrative of blackness. And so I wanted to, DeCarava was a very important influence for me early on, and I wanted to have that conceptual and material conversation with Roy DeCarava.
And Roy DeCarava and Langston Hughes collaborated on the Sweet
Flypaper of Life. Of course.
And I want to talk a little bit more about the role that darkness plays in the images, but I also want to hear you speak a little bit more about that connection between text and image, because in addition to being a prolific photographer, you're also quite a lyrical writer. And if you could speak to just the relationship between text and image and why it's important to you.
Well, for me, the text that I reference is a way of both referencing and connecting the work that I do to a larger history of black cultural production that also includes the literary. You know, that the literary can inspire visual forms. You know, so that's how I think about it, what it means conceptually. Night coming tenderly, black like me. I got the beautiful phrase. It's so poetic and profound in its implications. So for me, it's about using the text as inspiration, but also about situating the work in conversation with those texts in a way that situates it inside the work inside of this history of black culture production, which isn't limited to the literary or the photographic or musical, because music is another very deep inspiration for me. It's about connecting the work up to a larger history of Black cultural expression.
And now to the question about darkness. What does the role of darkness play in both the making and the reception of these images?
Well, as far as the making goes, my experience of making this work is not the same experience you're seeing. I did not make these photographs at nighttime. They were made, some of them early in the day, some of them later in the day. But that was just the raw material through which I shaped the idea of darkness and blackness. So the making of the work is very different from the photographs that you're seeing. It's not possible using conventional photographic materials, film, which I do, to make prints of this size and detail, photographing at night. You just won't get the information that you need. And I wanted to have all of the material information of the environment to give a sense in the work, not only of what that path of fugitivity looked like, but what it felt like materially. The grass, the leaves, the trees, the air, you know. So this idea of blackness is really, in this work, it's not a factual one. This is not documentation of the Underground Railroad, because the fact of it is the path of the Underground Railroad, of necessity, for the safety of those making passage, was never known, which gave me the freedom of looking at the landscape through a kind of act of radical imagination, reimagining that landscape as the terrain in proximity to some known locations. Like I photographed landscapes that were close to John Brown's house. And I even made a photograph of John Brown's tannery. This marsh is very close to where John Brown's house is. Did someone actually pass by there? We never know. I don't need to know. I'm trying to make a compelling visual representation using that idea. So the work is a kind of act of the imagination that is based on the fact of the history. But I'm not trying to, in a didactic way, go back and do the kind of work that traces the path. I'm trying to, through my work, reimagine that path.
And in a sense, the photographs become fugitive in themselves as objects, right?
True. Very, very true.
They sort of, they take on this illegibility, and they also aren't documentation of something, but they point to what is potentially something. I think that's a really compelling way to think about photographic practice or art practice in general.
Yeah, because at its foundational root, no photograph is literally documentary. There's the transformation of the lens and the material. The experience of looking at the world is not the same thing as any photograph of the world. Mm-hmm. That's kind of foundational to what photography is. Mm-hmm. You know, the use of the lens and a particular material transforms the world into something more subjective. Even, obviously, the framing, you know, because photographs leave out, quite frankly, more than they show. Mm. There's a whole, you know, wealth of information that lies outside of the frame. So I've never been, I guess you could say, burdened by the notion that photographs embody some inherent truth. Mm-hmm. It's always been about a kind of subjectivity, my ideas, my visualizations about the things that I want to make work about.
Do you find that your approach shifts between, say, the Birmingham Project, photographing individuals, compared to photographing the landscape?
Well, this work is the first work, actually the second, Harlem Redux, which is not a part of this work. Harlem Redux was the first work that I made that didn't center on the portrait. The Birmingham Project was the last work that I made that looked at history, but using the portrait as the vehicle for that. I haven't made or thought in any way about this project through the framework of the portrait since the Birmingham Project. I'm really interested in looking at the way that history, and for me, particularly aspects of African American history, are embedded within the American landscape. So for now, I'm firmly working in the tradition or the genre, if one believes in genres, that might be called landscape. I have no thoughts about portraits right now. I'm really interested in looking at the narrative of place, the history that's embedded in place, and how I can talk about that in a way that transforms those sites and places, both conceptually and materially, into the conversation that I want to provoke. So people have asked me, so you think your next project would be portraits? No, which is not to say, of course, that at some point in the future, I won't return to the human subject as the conceptual anchor of the work. But if we keep going and go to the next work, this is the installation of Night Coming Tenderly Black in the St. John's Episcopal Church.
Those are the photographs that are hanging above the pews.
They're suspended above the pews, and that church, St. John's Episcopal Church, was the final safe place where fugitive African Americans took refuge before going on to Lake Erie. So that site itself is very much a site of the history.
And this is in Cleveland, Ohio, this church.
Yeah, this is St. John's Episcopal Church, and people waiting to make passage across Lake Erie would go up into the Belfry Tower and watch for a signal, a lantern signal from Lake Erie, which was about a mile away. And then upon seeing that signal, they would come down and begin to make final passage along the Underground Railroad. So that particular church is an actual site, and it's an active church with a very small congregation.
Did the congregation interact with this installation?
And the minister was very receptive to the idea. Because there was a small enough congregation, he said, if you just leave the first 4 rows of pews available, we'd love to have you work in this space. There was a minister, a woman minister, and the congregation was very receptive to having this project in the church, because everyone in the church, including, of course, the minister, is and was aware of the significance of that site. So they were fully open to me activating that site through my work.
Will you continue to do interventions like this at other sites with this history series?
It could be called that. Could be called that. I think there's probably a lot of ways to describe what was going on here, because it didn't, you know, the project didn't begin with the church. Which, if it had, and my thinking about how to take that space and kind of not necessarily disrupt it, but to activate it in a different way, but certainly having the work hanging in the church was something that hadn't taken place in that church before, and I'm pretty sure it hasn't happened since.
Have you done anything like this before?
No. This was the first work that I made and installed with this degree of site specificity. And when people came to view the work, the idea was for them to sit quietly in the pews. And the photographs were large enough that if you sat in a pew and the photograph was here, you were kind of enveloped in the experience of the photograph. And people had all kinds of emotional and visceral responses sitting in the pews. Because you have to sit quietly and actually focus to see them, because they're quite dark. So there's a heightening of the attention to the photograph that takes place and was kind of transporting in that environment.
I've read about your work that it is a delicate balance between metaphor and lived experience. And I think that this installation is a tangible example of something like that writer is trying to describe. What do you think about that description of your work being a delicate balance between metaphor and lived experience?
I'll accept it. I'll accept it.
So now this is your most recent.
Yeah, this is the project that I just completed and was installed in the most recent Prospect exhibition in New Orleans. It's photographs that I'm kind of from the Birmingham Project, tracing my way back into the history, because the Night Coming Tenderly Black work, which is about the path of fugitivity away from the plantations, while this work is made at the site of 5 different plantations in Louisiana, all along the west bank of the Mississippi, because the Mississippi was the commercial highway, for lack of a better term, for the sugarcane and tobacco that was being produced on these plantations. So I did some research and initial visits to these sites, and I kind of wanted to bear witness in a very immediate way. I wanted to put myself in these places with this formative history. Like for African Americans, this is our first encounter with the experience of being here, the plantation. The plantation is so fundamental to not only the history of enslavement, but it's foundational to the creation and structuring of the American economy. I mean, the plantation is an absolutely foundational site. And so I wanted to go to these places to kind of, in a very immediate way, bear witness to them. I wanted to be in this place. The title, In This Here Place, comes from Toni Morrison, Beloved. And there's a piece of that book in which she talks about in this here place, like who we are in this here place, moving from that place to this place. So again, there's the literary reference that, for me, Toni Morrison is someone else who is very much an influence for the ambition of her work, for the way that history is brilliantly reimagined through her subjective literary voice in a way that I feel very much parallels the way I want my work to function, and that it's not meant to be a literal retelling, but a radical reimagining of, but based on actual history. Like how can we make something of that history and our moment to make that history resonate yet again. And so I spent 2 years photographing on the site of these 5 plantations, including evergreen plantation.
What was that experience like for you, that 5 years that you spent photographing on those 5 Louisiana plantations?
Well, it was interesting because I have friends who asked me, I could never go there. Dawoud, how can you even go there and be there? You know, when I went, I felt so torn, but for me, of the 5 places, the 5 plantation landscapes that I photographed on, 4 of them, most of them are actually fabricated or reconstructed landscapes.
Like living museum, not living museums, but sort of like tourists.
They found a cabin in South Carolina and they transported it to Louisiana, and they found another one here, and now we have 2 authentic cabins. Most of them are constructed. One of them, I'm forgetting the name right now, is completely fabricated. They're new cabins, kind of made to look old, but there is, it has shifted somewhat since the pandemic, obviously, but there's a huge plantation tourism business going on. And people come for whatever reason they come. Me, when I went to these sites, I never went to the big house. I wasn't interested in going to the big house. I was not interested in photographing in the big house. That was not the piece of history that I was interested in. I was interested in the space that enslaved African Americans inhabited and also built. The enslaved actually built these landscapes. It wasn't like it was built and they were bought. They built these landscapes, which is why that building looked like your grandmama's house in Georgia. I mean, the architectural sensibility that informed the building of these plantation cabins is very much an African retention. But evergreen, which is where this particular photograph is made, evergreen is the single largest intact plantation landscape in the American South. There are 37 buildings, including 22 cabins, that sit exactly where they always have sat. In the case of evergreen, since that plantation was created in 1742.
And who owns it? Who owns evergreen today?
A private family.
Okay.
And there's still behind it an active sugarcane industry, as there is for a number of those plantations. Sugarcane, I mean, you know how much sugar is consumed in this country. I mean, the sugarcane industry is still a very active one. But to return to your question of what did I feel, this thing that people imagine that you would feel going to these sites, the only place I actually felt it was at Evergreen, because that was an entirely undisturbed landscape. To me, it's a sacred site. And there is a very strong presence still felt there. And the custodian of Evergreen treats that with great respect. They have a minimal amount of plantation tourism at Evergreen. The primary income stream for Evergreen, they rent themselves out to the motion picture industry. Any of those slavery movies that you've seen in the last 10 years or so, the majority of them are shot at Evergreen, which allows them to not have to participate in the plantation tourism business. Because quite frankly, Evergreen, the way it is set up, with the cabins a good quarter or half a mile away from the big house is really not hospitable to the tourism industry. Most of those landscapes are set up, they will place 2 cabins right outside the door of the big house. They're basically structured to move people through them in a half-hour, 45-minute tour, which is not true to the actual history of those landscapes at all. But the only place that I very deeply and palpably felt that thing that people wanted to know, did you feel anything when you were there? Definitely at Evergreen. The other side of that is when anywhere I am doing my work, that's what I'm there to do. And I have a very laser-like focus on making the thing or the things that I'm there to make. I'm not there to have an emotional experience and then translate that into an object. All of that happened before. It's the reason that I'm there. But it doesn't tell you how to make anything. So once I'm there making the work, that's what I'm thinking about. Making the work, the shape of the work, the geometry of the pictures, the light. Move that door out a little bit to catch the light. Make that structure relate to that one. I'm making photographs. I'm making something. And that's what I'm thinking about. Mm-hmm. All of the other things, when I go away or when I'm in the process of, going to, but that's not my preoccupation when I'm there. Because I always say, the emotions are meaningful, but it doesn't tell you how to make anything. Making is its own particular challenge, materially, conceptually, and otherwise.
Was the Mississippi River, the role of the Mississippi River, the main reason why you selected the plantations that you selected, say, rather than selecting plantations along the southern eastern seaboard?
Yeah, because at one point, there were upwards of 350 plantations in that stretch of the Mississippi River between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. Mm. So it was a major center for the production of sugarcane by the enslaved populations that inhabited those plantations. And the other reason was that I've been spending a lot of time in New Orleans. Mm. New Orleans is kind of where I go to disappear. I just disappear. I just book myself. I stay in the same hotel. I have friends there, so that's my place. New Orleans is my place. And I started thinking about making work there. Can't stop thinking about making work, even when I'm going somewhere to get away. So I started thinking about if I were going, and this is the Mississippi River, by the way, right across the road from Evergreen Plantation. So part of the reason was that I was spending a lot of time in Louisiana already. I wanted to continue this history project that I was in the midst of, and the range of choices that I would have working in that particular location. As I began to research where might I go, River Road seemed to be the place that I could make to work. Mm. And it's only about a half hour, 45 minutes outside of New Orleans. Mm-hmm.
We have a excerpt from Evergreen, the 3-channel video that I'd like to show.
Yeah, other thing I didn't mention about the Birmingham work, there's also a split screen video that accompanies the Birmingham work. It's called 9/15/63 for September 15th, 1963. So for those 2 projects and for the one that I'm getting ready to start filming and photographing in Richmond, Virginia, the moving image gives me a different way to look at and think about this history. you know, the moving image in conjunction with sound. So it's a brief 1 minute excerpt, if we can
We'll play
show
it.
it. And the soundtrack is a collaboration with Imani Uzuri, a vocalist who I've worked with. Come by here, come by here, someone's praying, come by here, come by here, come by here, come by here, come by here. And that piece is, it's an 11-minute, 3-channel piece, 3 separate, here's an installation photograph of Evergreen. And of course, in this case, you know, the moving image and the sonic allows me to activate the experience of the place in a very different way, because it's a very silent space. And I wanted to work with Imani to kind of bring those voices and presences back to that landscape that enslaved African Americans once inhabited. So I don't know when I'm going to show it again. It was shown at Prospect, and then I showed it again in New York at Sean Kelly.
I wanted to ask you about that, showing these works, right, that are enriched by a fraught history of enslavement in the US in a commercial gallery space. What do you think about this work as a consumable object?
It's my work. And the work functions in multiple kinds of arenas. On the one hand, it was at Prospect. I was really determined to show the work in some place that was in close proximity to where the work was made. So Prospect was perfect for that. And then the work goes out into the world. So as an artist, do I make consumable objects? I don't think I'm alone in that. So I don't think there's any particular so-called issue with that. For me, the work is more about provoking a conversation. And those conversations can be provoked in a gallery. They can be provoked in a museum. They can be provoked in any number of different settings. But I kind of get what the question alludes to, but for me it's not a question, so I don't really know how to go much deeper into it.
I hear a lot of young artists that are dealing with issues around race and representation and also sexuality and gender, particularly in the climate that we live in now, and a sort of resurgence of civil rights movements, that a lot of young artists really grapple with their relationship to the market when their work is about identity or history. And that's where that question comes from, you know, seeing an artist like yourself who is able to create work that can exist seamlessly in these different kinds of forums and platforms.
Yeah, because for me, I was, from a particular point in my career, I was doing a lot more work with museums, which is very different from the experience of the work in a gallery. Museums have a kind of implied publicness to them. Mm-hmm. And also museums don't sell anything. Mm-hmm. They're places where one comes to experience the work. So my thinking initially has always been with that kind of context in mind, because I want the work that I do to also be in conversation with the larger history of other related objects of this kind, mm-hmm. photographs or the moving image. And in the context of a museum, it tends to get folded into a larger conversation, into which I want to situate my conversation about the place of blackness, the place of African American history within this larger history, which is very much a part of, in the art historical sense.
Absolutely.
And then the gallery, that's another kind of public situation. In my case, I do know that most of the work of mine that's actually acquired in a gallery setting ends up in a museum. So I think people have a certain notion about what a museum is, mm-hmm. Because the price tag, for reasons of the market, has to be placed on the work. But I don't know how it is for other artists, and that doesn't preclude certainly individuals. But I do know that most of the work of mine that has been acquired by public institutions, by museums, which then takes the work out of the gallery and then situates it back in a kind of public museum discourse. So I don't think the gallery is the place where work goes to die on the walls of rich people. It's not the way I think about the gallery at all.
Thank you. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
You're welcome.